integrated because they needed an African who could infiltrate into the great movement that was led by Marcus Garvey so that they could destroy that. So yeah, there's corruption. There's buffoonery in our communities right now that poses as leadership. There are liars and cheats, careerists who have no interest in a free Africa or free anything in our communities today. But the reason they are there successfully is because this government has murdered every leader who stood up and has attempted to lead us into a better day. That's why it's the truth. Who would listen to Al Sharpton if they had murdered King? Who would listen to Jesse Jackal and some of the others, even the so-called Muslim leaders, if they hadn't murdered Malcolm? These are people who were able to emerge and pretend to be some kind of leaders because they murdered real leaders. People who had their eye on a genuine freedom, a genuine liberation of our people. In 1972, May, when the Organization of African Unity was formed, it was a poor substitute for what Garvey and Nkrumah had called for. They talked about a united African state. A united African state, common state, where they could have a common defense strategy, a common national economy crossing all of those artificial borders that were put there by imperialism. But Nkrumah accepted it because the imperialists fought him tooth and nail, and they used every little puppet that they had put in power in these artificial so-called countries there to keep this united Africa that Nkrumah talked about from emerging. So in 1972 was born this thing called the Organization of African Unity. And from its inception, of course, it was a joke of sorts, in the sense that you had neo-colonial entities, you had governments that were controlled by imperialist power that came together. In fact, our friend Kenneth Kaunda from Zambia, stood up and made his famous call at the founding meeting of the Organization of African Unity for the creation of a all-African bank. That was the first thing on his mind. He said we needed an all-African bank. And I was impressed that at the time there was this man in Algeria, because this was during the heat of the Algerian Revolution, where Algerians were fighting against the French. And his name was Ben Bella. Was it Ben Bella? Ahmed Ben Bella. That was his name. And he stood up and said, yeah, we need a bank. All right, but we need a blood bank. He said, we need a blood bank because all of us should march against that rotten regime in South Africa. That was Ben Bella versus Kenneth Kaunda. So this this Organization of African Unity from its very inception had a lot to be desired. But it was at this meeting, May 25th, 1972, that African Liberation Day was resolved. This is where it came from. May 25th, 1972, at the founding of the Organization of African Unity. It's interesting because it would be many years. I said 72, but actually 65. It was 1965, not 72. It would be many years later that the first African Liberation Day mobilization was held. And that would be in 1972. In fact, I was one of the international, I was on the National Organized Coordinating Committee to make the first African Liberation Day mobilization happen. And this was because a man whose name was then Owusu Sadauki had traveled to Mozambique. And he had, in Mozambique, where our people were fighting against the Portuguese, he had traveled with the guerrillas fighting against the Portuguese, and asked what could Africans in this country do. And he was told that you can go back and organize Solidarity African Liberation Day based on that resolution from May of 1965. Organized African Liberation Day. And so Owusu came back here. And that's how African Liberation Day was organized in this country and various other places at the same time. It happened some places in the Caribbean as well. And during the process of organizing for African Liberation Day, in one of the meetings I attended in New York City, we got word that Cleve Sellers, who was a very courageous member, organizer in the South during the 1960s, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, had brought word that Stokely Carmichael was opposed to African Liberation Day mobilization. Because this ALD was to raise resources for our brothers and sisters who were fighting against colonialism as it still existed on the continent of Africa. In Guinea, Bissau, Portuguese territories, controlled territories, Angola and Mozambique. And it was also supporting the struggle against our people supporting the struggle of our people in Rhodesia, as it was called then, and South Africa. And we were told that Stokely, who at the time was living on the continent, was opposed to African Liberation Day because it somehow would impact negatively on the independent states of Africa, which was a weird thing for us. But African Liberation Day happened anyway. I never understood the logic of that, and I never understood why people felt like they had to send people to Africa. They did, to meet with heads of states to make sure that it was all right to do African Liberation Day. But African Liberation Day happened, and it was a magnificent mobilization. But I should mention to you that even by the time of African Liberation Day in 1972, the Black Revolution in this country had been effectively defeated. The U.S. government had, through a reign of assassinations, they had killed King, they had killed Malcolm X, they killed more than 30 members of the Black Panther Party in 1969 alone, 68 alone. Of course, in 1969, you remember the murder of Fred Hampton in Chicago. So they had done a devastating job. But the mobilization still, in 1972, was significant. In fact, it was significant to our party because it was through this mobilization that we pulled together the African People's Socialist Party. 1973, the next mobilization was held under the slogan, "There is no peace. Africa is at war." And I think that is significant that, 38 years ago, that the slogan was, "There is no peace. Africa is at war." Because there were white people engaged in peace movements throughout this country, just as we've seen happen recently. At the time, it was Vietnam. that was significant. Now, of course, recently we've seen actions by so-called peace activists around the question of Iraq, less around Afghanistan, etc. And because of that, the Black is Back Coalition was founded. And just a couple of months ago here in Washington, D.C., held a conference in March under the slogan, the conference, a national conference against the other wars. And that is because just as in the 1960s, the white left and white activists did not have the ability to recognize the most critical wars happening in the world, today that is still the case. They can see Iraq, and we are opposed to the terror that U.S. government is waging against the people of Iraq. They can see Afghanistan, and we are opposed to the terror that's being waged against the people of Afghanistan. But they are blind to Haiti. They treat Haiti like it's some kind of tragedy, as opposed to U.S. imperial involvement and intervention. They can't see Congo, where since 1998, maybe 7 million African people have been killed, fighting proxy wars for U.S. and other imperialist interests. They can't see most of Africa. They couldn't even see Ivory Coast, Cote d'Ivoire, where, and they can't see France. And this is what I want to mention to you. So I've talked too long already, is that there's a whole different world that's trying to happen. And it is driving imperialism into a frenzy. And that we have a responsibility to shape and define what this world is going to look like. Because just because imperialism, as it is today, is being threatened, just because it's being undermined, it does not automatically translate that it's going to be something that is favorable to black people, to African people anywhere around the world. That we have to define our own interests and fight for our own interests, that we have to achieve the organizational capacity to do that. That African Liberation Day is not just some kind of celebration where we get together and do funny handshakes and listen to good culture. But we have to see it as an opportunity to inform ourselves and to organize ourselves for our liberation as a people. That's the fundamental point that I wanted to make to you today. That you look at what's happening with the bombing in Egypt. I'm sorry, I'm overcoming now. I just had surgery on my vocal cords. But you look at what's happening, the bombing that's happening in Libya today. Where is the peace movement? Where is any of the peace movement talking about what's happening in Libya? You can't find them today. Why can't you find them? They say, well, they say this Arab Spring is happening. They say freedom is breaking out all over northern Africa and the Middle East. And they call this freedom what they see happening in Egypt and Tunisia. And that is meaningful. What's tried to happen, what's happening, what's attempting to occur in Egypt and Tunisia. But it's not the whole story. And what's happening in Egypt and Tunisia has nothing to do with what's happening in Libya. And I just want to say this to you briefly, that there's something happening in the world today, that there's a whole change in the relations of power happening throughout the world, that the whole world economy that we live in today is one that was forged through slavery and colonialism, that capitalism itself was born through selling our grandparents. This capitalism came through selling us, selling black people The whole trade in black people is what created the world economy, that created the conditions for capitalism to exist. That much of what you see throughout the world today was forged through this process of our captivity and dispersal around the world. That all of what you see, the colonies in Latin America, wouldn't be no Cuba, wouldn't be no Brazil, wouldn't be no Trinidad, wouldn't be no Jamaica, wouldn't be any of those places except for the enslavement and transfer of African people around the world. This world economy that used to be referred to as the triangle economy was a necessary precondition for the rise of capitalism as a system. That and the attack against the people of Asia and the people here in the Americas, not just us, but the so-called Indians who are living in concentration camps that they call reservations today, whose lands were stolen from them. They didn't just create the false borders in Africa, they created false borders everywhere. When you look at throughout the Middle East, those are borders that they created for their benefit to steal the resources of the people there. This is the world that we're living in today, and this is the world that everybody's fighting against today. To change this damn relationship. This is the basis of the crisis that they're experiencing today. Because every piece of bread that they feed their nasty little children come as a consequence of bread that's been stolen from black people and brown people and yellow people around the world. That's why we live in a world where half the people on the planet Earth live off less than $2 a day. That's why on the continent of Africa, south of the Sahara, Africans live off less than $1 a day because of this world economy that was created through slavery and colonialism, and we must hate it and oppose it and do everything necessary to overturn it. That's how we live, like we live today, because we're African people. You know that, don't you? You can't get on a boat in Africa as an African in 1619 or whenever they kidnapped us and then get off here as a Negro. If we were Africans when we got on the boat in Africa, when we got off in Jamestown, Virginia, we were still Africans. If we were Africans when we got on the boat in Africa, when we got off that boat, that same boat, someplace in the islands, how did we become Trinidadians? We were Africans then, we're Africans now. But the first thing a thief does who steals something is scratch the name off, doesn't it? Scratch the name off and then put another name on it. Confuses everybody about who the real ownership belongs to. So now we don't even recognize each other when we see each other, even though we look just like each other. Look at them Haitians over there. We got places like in the Bahamas. I was just there recently. We're organizing there. They're doing African Liberation Day there right now in solidarity and unity with this African Liberation Day. There are less people in the Bahamas than in the small city that I live in now in Florida. There are only 300,000 people there. They call themselves a nation, a Bahamian nation. And the Bahamian nation, you know, they're different from Jamaicans or Barbadians. There are less than 1 million African people in Equatorial Guinea. There may be less than 1 million African people in Namibia. And we walking around calling ourselves different kinds of nations in all of these places, which undermines our consciousness, our strength, our organizational capacity, everything. And here we are Negroes and African Americans and Obamamites. Our future is as one people, organized to win our freedom. But just recognizing that we are Africans is not enough. It's important to recognize that we are African people, and that's a critical thing. Your brothers, your sisters, your neighbors, the people in your community need to know that. Not just in this country, that's true throughout the continent of Africa too. People are confused on the continent of Africa. locked us into these little tiny entities that they created. They're the ones who drew the borders that they now call Ghana. They're the ones who drew the borders of what they now call Ivory Coast. They're the ones who drew the borders of what they call Djibouti and Kenya and all those places. We didn't do that. They did that. And we now walk around calling ourselves by those names that they created. And they, of course, it increases our weaknesses and makes us much more vulnerable to all kinds of attacks. And we walk around not being Africans. I'm Trinidadian. I'm African American. I'm a black Brit, etc. But you know what? France doesn't have any problem with that. The French are Pan-Africanists. They exploit all of Africa. They don't give a damn what part of Africa you come from. They want a piece of it. The Germans don't care. You running from Africa, and Africa's never done a damn thing to you. Africa didn't put us on welfare. Africa didn't kill Sean Bell. It's Europe and imperialism that has done that. Let me tell you about France. Did you know? You know that France lived off Haiti for more than 100 years. You know that, don't you? They talk about how poor Haiti is. They used to call Haiti the pearl of the Antilles because it was Haitian labor created a resource, fed France. All of France lived off Haiti. But not just France, but here from Ivory Coast. Did you know that of the colonial pact that France created, that there's something like 13, used to be I think 14, so-called francophone states on the continent of Africa, that every one of them with independence, every one of them had to sign a pact with France, where France gets 65% of their foreign reserves are in the French treasury. It goes to France. And then another 20% of that, another 20%, an additional 20% goes for some kind of service charges that's paid to France for administering the 65%. Guess what? The Africans in Africa, in the so-called Francophone, they don't even know how much money there is. If they need money, and they always need money because they're only living off 15% of the gross domestic product, they're only living off 15%, and they're getting cheated anyway because of the trade relationships. So they don't know how much money it is. If they need money, guess what they have to do? They borrow it from where? From France. They have to borrow their own money from France, paying commercial rates to do that with. So France, this tiny France that doesn't produce anything but murder. This tiny France, that if they lost Africa, if France lost Africa, France would be destitute tomorrow. So its economy now is based on everything that is how imperialists, they talk to us about how poor and worthless and incapable and inept we are when all the white world is living at our expense, including France. Did you hear what I just said? It's like if you have $1 and somebody takes 85 cents of that dollar and leaves you with only 15 cents. That's what France is doing to 13 so-called African states in Africa today. And that's how the whole setup is. That's not just in France and so-called Francophone states, but the whole continent of Africa is being ripped off by imperial white power in the same way. All of the world is being ripped off by imperialism in the same way. And that's why people are fighting back, and that's why we have to fight back. Because we have to refuse to live this way, because imperialism has defined every damn thing about from our names to everything about us. Imperialism has to set what our future is going to be. Imperialism has said that your child won't have a future. Imperialism has said that your children can be shot down in the streets like dogs, whether it's in Washington, D.C., or whether it's someplace on the continent of Africa. Imperialism has made that determination that they can take your oil, your coltan, your cocoa beans, all your resources for nothing. Your only job is to work, 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 and produce for imperial white power. And when you try to shake that up, then you're some kind of terrorist or some kind of fiend that has to be destroyed. So we oppose to that. And when we talk about African Liberation Day, we're talking about a movement to overturn that, to change that. Because we believe that this is a generation of black people around the world that's determined to be free, that's determined to make sure that our children will have a future based on what we do, what we decide, as opposed to somebody else. And so this is not just going to be a discussion. And we've created the ability for people to join the movement. And we've created an ability, programs, strategies, to try and deal with this situation and overturn imperialism and our relationship with imperialism. There's a power shift that's happening in the world. You saw it with the frantic efforts of this country when it came to Venezuela. The fear they have with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. Of course, there's Morales in Bolivia and other forces throughout the Americas. Remember, they were celebrating Fidel's going to die any day now, and it's going to be over. But the fact is that all over South America, there's a change happening, and they can't do anything about it. Used to be that they'd overturn it just like that. And of course, they're working overnight to try to make that happen. Power shift is happening. That's what you see throughout the Middle East. Right now, the speech that Barack Obama made the other day about the Middle East and Northern Africa and Israel is an attempt to try to catch up to events. Egypt, Tunisia, Uncle Tom regimes, terrible regimes, always oppress the people. The United States government was giving Egypt more than $2 billion a year to that military to oppress the people of Egypt. And this uprising shook them. And it's not over yet because the military is still in power, even though they got rid of the head. That's why the head doesn't matter who they put up in front of it. Just like Obama is Bush. Doesn't matter because this system is based on expropriating value, stealing wealth, and terrorizing the peoples around the world. Doesn't matter who the head is. They'll cut the head off themselves if the head doesn't work. You saw what they did to Kennedy. So, Egypt, the people rise up and shook them. The people rose up in Tunisia, shook them to the foundation. People are even trying to shake them up in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Yemen, even in Algeria, places like that, which have been lapdogs for imperialism. And when that happened, it challenged this illegitimate white nationalist settler state of Israel. You know, Israel is a white nationalist settler state, don't you? No, Israel is a place where white people left Europe. They said they left Europe because of terror that was committed against them by Germans and other places in Europe, and they went to Palestine. At one time, they had decided that their national homeland was Uganda. You didn't know that, did you? So they ended up and they went to Palestine, stole the land of the people. And then what they do? Scratch the name off. Change the name from Palestine to Israel. Call themselves Israelis. And then raised up a language that had been dead for thousands of years called Hebrew. Made that the national language. Took the resources of the people, and the imperialists supported. Why they support it? Because it's white people who have nothing in common with the people, the Arab people there. It's white people who will protect the imperialist oil interests in that region. And so Egypt got the largest share of military resources coming from the U.S. I mean, Israel did. Egypt, the second largest. And now, with Egypt being shaken, it threatens Israel. It threatens that arrangement. Tunisia threatens that arrangement. Bahrain, the Fifth Fleet was created and put in Bahrain in order to protect U.S. interests in that region. Now people are rising up in Bahrain. So there's a power shift that's happening. And what makes it threatening is because you've got places like Iran that was always opposed to imperialism. You got places like Libya that was opposed to imperialism in solidarity with the people of Palestine. And as soon as this thing got out of hand, what they attempted to do was overthrow the regime in Iran. They tried to create so-called spontaneous uprising in Iran, and it didn't work. They tried it in Libya and Syria, because these are also forces that are opposed to the illegitimate white nationalist settler state of Israel. And they're bombing people in Libya today in order to protect their interests. It's got nothing to do with the Egyptian thing, except that the loss of Egypt, or the threat or the undermining of the Egyptian authority, gave greater significance to the existence of Libya, Iran, and Syria. Anyway, I've talked too much. I hope that you understand some things about what's happening. And I hope that this helps you to understand that what we have to do is to get organized. And there's going to be, during this process, discussions about different ways that people can hook up and be organized to combat this terrible oppressor that we've got, because the people are winning every place. And we need to take our place in the ranks of the oppressed peoples around the world to build the future the way we think it ought to be built as African people. It cannot be built by us in Washington, D.C. or the United States alone. We are Africans. We are Africans. We are one people dispersed around the world. That's our power. That's our strength. That's the underbelly of imperialism. That's the thing that's going to bring it down. Because of this connection, because they are having the same mobilization right now as we have this discussion in London, England, the African Liberation Day from the African Socialist International. Right now, as I mentioned in Nassau, they're having the same mobilization. We've got to make this happen throughout the world. This is the underbelly of imperialism. Because Africans spread throughout the world, we have the ability to strike imperialism a death blow. We can undermine it every place on earth. We can undermine it in France. We can make sure that our brothers and sisters who are struggling against imperialism, French imperialism, are supported by our efforts right here. We can make sure that our brothers and sisters in Haiti do not stand alone, because they cannot fight imperialism by themselves there, nor can we fight it alone here. So we have to recognize that we are part of one international revolutionary movement, and that our future is going to be determined not by people who make good speeches or not by great leaders and things like that, but by masses of African working people organized, who are committed to revolutionary transformation. That's the organization, that's the struggle that we are making right now. That's the purpose of our being here on today. And I thank you for sharing this with me. Uhuru.